It's an important event, so I don't want to waste a lot of time. And we are very happy to be able to have this joint training, and I think we should do more of this kind among 4 evaluation offices. This kind of initiative is a very important issue, which is gender mainstreaming in our evaluations. It's a challenge, right?
So this morning then, in this first session, we're going to look at perspective, or framework, or lens, however you want to call it, something that we look at the world with, that we look at our evaluation with. So when I was reading through all the documents that came to me over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that stood out for me with the WFP technical guidelines was there was a little statement there that there's absent or low attention to the gender dimension, and this appeared to be due to oversight rather than the evaluation subject. So I was really interested in that word oversight, and what's at the back, or what's at the root of that oversight. Is it a lack of awareness? Is it a lack of commitment? Is it a lack of perspective or limited perspective? So that really resonated with me, is how can we address, how can we get to the bottom of dealing with the oversight, whatever that might be. So a lot of people were saying also in the survey that they wanted to look at the practical application of tools. And everything that we'll be using today is some kind of a tool. There's no silver bullet to help us when we're looking at gender. There's no one tool. This is what you use. This is going to give you the answer. It's a social issue, so it's a bit of a messy art. It's not a hard, rigorous science, although we're trying to now frame it more in sort of a numerical way through things like the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. But some of the tools then that we have at our use are the UNEG guidelines, which I think at least half of you were familiar with. I don't know to what extent you've used them, but you were familiar with them. And we're going to be using those throughout the day too. So even if you've looked at them, you'll be applying them through the day. Then there's the agency technical guidelines, which I also found very well organized, very well laid out. So I don't know how many are familiar with your own agency guidelines, but they were good. The RBM frameworks, so what we've come up with within our own organizations, from strategies, from projects, country programs, those are tools to help move us forward. Somebody mentioned the SWOP, so the SWOP scorecard and that whole process. And then in terms of, one of the parts of the terms of reference for evaluation is identifying the stakeholders and understanding the context. So these are also tools to help us through. I don't know how many people are familiar with gender audits. ILO has done sort of a process and developed a process of doing a gender audit, which is looking at an institution or an organization or even national program in terms of how gender has been addressed. So there's a lot of different criteria within that for looking at particularly institutional issues. So some of you may be interested in checking that out more. Then more at the field level, of course, for those of you engaged in projects, we have the participatory evaluation tools. Maybe not all of them are focused on evaluation, but they've been adapted to evaluation. And then finally we come to what I've called analytical frameworks. And to me, this is at the root of everything that we're doing. We really want to bring this perspective. So for me, before we get into perspective, from all the work I've done from 20 years of working on gender issues, to me the key tools, yes, we have guidelines, yes, we have checklists, we have all that, but it's bringing, number one, a perspective, number two, committing to a process, and it seems you've all committed to this process, to actually take this forward and work together beyond just today. Another one is peers. So really turning to your peers, asking for help, giving guidance. We've got the gender focal points in some of the organizations. So that peer support is such an important part of moving forward in this area. And I say persistence because sometimes you get resistance, sometimes you get backlash, but persisting is one way of moving the agenda forward on addressing gender equality and women's empowerment. in evaluation and in all areas. And then I think probably most importantly, and this is what today is really about, is practice. Because again, we get so little time in our very busy days and very busy weeks. There's always a deadline, or I remember seeing the red stickers in 1994, rush. So there's always those rushes that come to you. So to find that time in your week, to actually have that time to reflect and to talk. So this is a day of practice. And I hope it's not just a day, but it continues on. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was engaged as a consultant over 18 months with CARE, and it gave me an opportunity to learn about the framework that they were using. And they used it for their strategic impact inquiry, which looked at, I think it was 1,600 projects across their organization from a women's empowerment perspective. So in terms of CARE's framework, it's the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture framework, and it was really a women's empowerment framework that we adapted to agriculture. There's 3 dimensions here, and it's called a Women's Empowerment in Agriculture framework, but it's still with the intent of looking at gender equality, not just making lives better for women, but making lives better for women and men. A lot of you may know a livelihoods approach. This takes a different tack at looking at how we live. And one of the dimensions is agency. So that's, as it says in the left-hand column, so it's the interplay of changes in her own aspirations and capabilities. And we could say her or his, actually, because we're looking at men's and women's. There's some different ideas within the top box there of what this agency means. And probably what agency might mean to some of you is when we're looking at, do women or men participate in training? Who's involved in which activities? Are we doing literacy work with them? These are all the kinds of agency issues that we may think of. So in the yellow box at the top, these are some of the sub-dimensions that we're thinking about when we look at agency. So that's the individual, and then we look at relations. So we could be looking at or family, or relations with community, relations with, husband or some other people in the household. So what are those kinds of dynamics that go on there in that dimension of relations? So as you can see, there's the ability to organize, to lead, and to influence, the freedom of mobility and to form coalitions, the ability to engage men's groups as support and change agents. So that's another issue. One of the things we really want to look at is how we engage men, especially when we're looking at resistance and backlash. And then change in institutional and individual attitude and behaviors towards women. And this is really key when we're looking at agriculture. Who has access to land? Are there issues of land title? How do people access inputs and extension? Those kinds of things. And the last one then is structure. So you could think of this as being norms and customs and policies, legal frameworks, all these kinds of things that underlie our society and that kind of reinforce these social relations and the way that we behave with each other. So as we see, there's these different dimensions when we look at any issue. So if we want to look at land rights, if we want to look at crop production, if we want to look at information dissemination, knowledge sharing, communication, extension, forestry, if we look at any of those and put those in the center of this, we can start to look at agency, relations, and structure. And what are the different dimensions that we might need to think about? This is important when we come to framing our questions for evaluation. And when we come to looking at what kinds of criteria, if we want to look at inclusiveness, if we want to look at the social equity issues related to the criteria and the questions. And then it really comes into play when we want to look at the indicators that we want to develop for our projects, for our programs, for our strategies. So it's good to keep this sort of broader lens as we're looking at our evaluation issues. So how might this framework then help you understand gender perspective in your evaluation? The idea is trying to broaden our perspective beyond looking at, maybe numbers in seats in trainings, trying to look at what outcomes, how can we look at outcomes, where might this fit in feeding us in terms of outcomes or intermediate objectives or impact. So how would this be helpful? And then what more might you need? Where, do you see something else that has to come into the picture? So this is only part of it. There are many different ways of looking at evaluation, of looking at our work. Probably a lot of you know the livelihoods work, so that is often at the back of where people are coming from to inform their perspective. So any initial thoughts? Where do men fit into this?
Perhaps for your second question, that we found a little bit missing was the dynamic. The 3 levels are useful, the triangle is useful, but what about looking for who are the movers of change? And they may be men, and they may be women. Who are the allies, the champions of gender, of changes in gender relations in the program, operation, whatever it is you're looking at?
Excellent. We're already starting to adapt it and change it, which is a great idea. Okay, I really like that idea of the whole idea of bringing in the movers of change. That is really, really important in all agencies.
It's been really great meeting with the other agencies. It's the first opportunity we have to work with the other agencies on a collaborative effort. And this not only is it allowing us to learn from the different perspectives and our colleagues, but it's also a great networking opportunity, and I hope we continue to do events similar to this in the future.
Even if not the training, the training itself is very useful, but then the perspectives that the participants have brought and then in the interactions with them, that in itself has been a wonderful learning experience for me.
So session 2, we looked at the evaluation criteria and framing questions. And as we've been working with the UNEG guidelines, looking at the cycle of evaluation. So of course, because it's only a 1-day workshop, we can't use all of the different parts of the cycle, but based on the survey and people's interest, I felt that the framing of questions was quite an important one, and it did turn out that way throughout the day, that people were very interested in looking at how to frame the questions. So using, again, this gender perspective, the analytical framework, but also using the UNEG guidelines themselves to really help guide the development and framing of the questions. It notes that we should derive the questions from the interventions theory of change, or reconstruct where there's not a clearly or formally articulated theory of change. And I think you may, one of the things that I find is the theory of change, for me anyhow, from the things that I've reviewed over the last few years, seems to be talked about a lot more now. So if you were reviewing a project or an initiative that came into place a few years ago, you might not have such a clearly constructed theory of change. And a lot of the theories of change, they might also not have anything specifically about gender. So you may want to reconstruct or formally articulate something on that. So the UNEG guidelines also note that the disaggregation of data, so we really want to look at who is involved, who is being impacted, and the inclusion of the stakeholders is a cornerstone of evaluations. And this makes sense because when we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about diversity and who's being impacted differently at different levels, whether it's institution, whether it's thematic, whatever. Also, when we're thinking about our questions, think about multiple sources. You know, who are you going to be talking to, where the evidence is going to come from, what kind of evidence, and how you're going to triangulate to answer the questions. So these are all the things that the UNEG, I've just really put together a summary of it.
Taking into account gender issues and women empowerment issues in evaluation will feed into the planning and programming in all projects and development initiatives implemented and designed by development agencies.
This is something I found really interesting because the other index we were looking at was defining empowerment based on an index. CARE also, again, just because I have been doing a lot of work with CARE over the years, they did some work in Burundi, visioning empowerment with women and men. And what they did was work with women and men to get them to come up with their own criteria for how they considered empowerment. So really they're coming up with their own indicators. And then they worked with an artist over the time, and they came together with this sort of group drawing. So this represents the different indicators that women wanted to include in the diagram of empowerment for their group. And so we see, there's a household there, a nice house, there's some animals, there's a woman taking a child to school. Up here, I think it's a woman and a man who are participating in a meeting. And also, I think one of them has to do with being able to represent themselves legally. I can't remember exactly what that one is up in the corner because it's hard to see, but I think it's more to do with the sort of the legal issues. And here there's a nice business with carrying things off to the market in the truck, so being able to engage in markets. I guess that's a healthy, happy family in the circle at the bottom, and having a stall so that they can have income here on the right, and then the vegetable garden up in the top corner. So this was a very interesting participatory evaluation process that focused on women's empowerment, again within the context of value chains, agriculture, which was the focus of it, but again could be carried into other sectors and themes too. So interesting to see, when you sit down with people and actually start asking what is empowerment to them, not specifically maybe in those words, but really getting them to look at what they see as empowerment. It's also very valuable for our work. And so there were a number of different categories that the women looked at and that men looked at. And one of them was coming up with a level of decision making. And so we just saw something similar to this in the index. And women came up with their own sort of sub-indicators of how they saw themselves as being empowered or not. And as you go to from 1 to 5, it becomes more empowered. So at the bottom, it would be women who do not feel concerned by meetings. Maybe they're not aware, maybe they're not, interested. Women who go to meetings, but there's no active participation, and on and up. So all the way through women who propose themselves to take responsibilities in the groups. So women came up with these criteria themselves, and they felt that along the levels of decision making, those who actually had the confidence to propose themselves, they were higher on the empowerment level. And so this is participation in community meetings. So there were a number of different areas, again, like the index. So I didn't get into a lot of it. I just wanted to bring up a couple for interest. So this, again, participation in community meetings. So women who are not interested by community meetings, and it doesn't necessarily say why, but I imagine that it's lack of interest, lack of awareness that would have to be looked at in deeper perspective there, and women who do not have the permission of their husband or somebody else in the family, I imagine, to take part. So moving up again to women who participate in all the meetings. And here we mentioned earlier about, do they speak, or is participating enough of empowerment? So anyway, I think it's interesting to look and to remember that we have criteria for empowerment.
This training is very useful because even though many of us may have experiences in dealing with gender issues, we don't always apply the same framework, and we're not always updated with the latest findings, techniques and experiences.
So in this session, we've focused on 3 different types of evaluations. We focused on a country program and a policy level. Some people were interested in institution and policy level evaluations, and we also focused on a thematic evaluation on crop production. So it allowed people, like the other sessions, to self-select which session interested them, which kind of approach, and which kind of thematic which kind of evaluation they were interested in.
The first scenario was mentioning 4 aspects in particular in this thematic evaluation on crop production, and those were international treaties, seeds and plant genetic resources, conservation agriculture, and farmer field schools. So what we thought is by going by the method, we would see, what fits best for each of those aspects, because they don't necessarily work at the same level. For example, the international treaty is more higher level kind of stuff. So that was a way we could handle it. But that was the challenge, the fact that it was so broad encompassing, and that you would have to look at the gender perspective at the very high level, higher plane, as well as the field level. So In terms of the methods and the data collection, we thought, because it's a thematic evaluation, we would rely a lot on the secondary data. So the way we've organized it was in two broad methods, which the first one we put under desk review, and the second one would be the case studies. The desk review, again, is very all-encompassing, but we analyze, for example, for the treaty, international treaty part, to see the compliance of the national legislation or policy framework with these international treaties in relation to gender equality. So basically, a lot to do with access to resources, to, you know, whether it's land or seeds or all these things that has to do, and see whether the national framework would be compliant with those international treaties.
So at the end of the day, we did a wrap-up, and we did a certain number of takeaways. What did people take away from the day? What do they want to see in the future? And of course, the issue of capacity was one that carried through the day. People feeling like they need capacity in certain areas. One of the big areas is still in institutional evaluations and policy level evaluations. I think people still really struggle with how to address gender equality at that level. So it's something that people really want to look at in another session. People find it much more intuitive when they're looking at a project level evaluation. Everything seems a little bit more straightforward to them. So that's probably something that we'll be looking at in the future.
We have a lot of challenges in the evaluation field about how to assess these issues in the appropriate way. I think there's some challenges we have to still address because most of us are working at more of a strategic level. We're not talking about project level evaluation. So we're not talking necessarily about women's role in the household, but more how large international decentralized organizations can affect something from their normative position, basically, that affects eventually women's roles in households and communities and improves their position in terms of agriculture.
Definitely we'll apply this training to our daily work. Thank you.